The other day I was asked how I make my rod leashes. It's pretty straightforward. At one end I've got a buckle, and this piece stays attached to the kayak all the time. I've got several of these and I can move it around depending on where I want the rod leash. And then at the other end I've got a simple slip knot with a jam knot at the end. That goes around the butt of the rod and then it pulls tight. And in between it's just paracord with the centre taken out and replaced with strimmer line. It's then heated and you can hold these coils in a nice position like that. It works really well. Now I've made mine slightly complicated because I've put it in two stages. That means that the high wearing areas where you attach the rod can be taken out and replaced with another piece like this. You don't have to replace the whole rod leash, but you can make it just with one continuous section. So I'll show you how I made it. To make the rod leash, you'll need some paracord. This is about 230 centimeters long and 4 millimeters thick. You'll also need some strimmer line. Now this needs to be slightly thinner, so 3 mil, and shorter as well by about a couple of feet because you'll need tag ends at either end of the paracord. You'll also need a couple of bits of black webbing, one that's about 6 inches long, the other one 3 or 4 inches long. Now if you're making the rod leash as one continuous section without worrying about that join, then you don't need the 3 or 4 inch long piece. You'll also need something to mould the paracord around once it's got the strimmer line through it. This doesn't have to be anything very complicated, just needs to be long enough to have all your coils on, but also it's worth remembering that the external diameter of this will be the internal diameter of your rod leash, so don't make it too thick. You'll need a piece of sandpaper, some cheap nasty string, a lighter, and something to make your whipping to attach your buckle. Finally, you'll also need a D-ring. The one thing that isn't here is a sewing machine, which you need in order to make the webbing attached to the buckle, but you can just use very strong glue. The other thing is a way to heat up the paracord once it's on your mould. Now I'm going to use a kettle and boiling water, and then it's going to be soaked for 15 minutes or so, but you can use a heat gun. The first job is to make this section. I put a couple of lines of stitching all along there and there in the 6-inch piece of webbing, and then put some super glue on it just to make sure it holds in place. Now you don't have to stitch it. If you don't have access to a sewing machine, then don't worry about it. You can just use a very, very strong glue. But you need to make sure that you've got a loop there, which is why once I folded it over, I folded one piece into the middle and the other piece into the middle, and then stitched it there. So you end up with a loop that you can attach to your D-clip. You may need to just snip off the melted ends, but eventually you should be able to get access at the core. Hopefully it will be a different colour like it is with mine. And then you just need to tease it out. There we go. You won't need the core anymore. Now before we start inching the strimmer line inside the paracord, it's worth taking the piece of sandpaper and just sanding down the tips of the strimmer line. It can be quite sharp and you don't want it to be sticking through the paracord at any point because you'll start to weaken the paracord. Okay. Very gently just start teasing the paracord over the top of the strimmer line. You'll want to end up with one end having about 4 inches or so free, the strimmer cord, and the remaining 20 inches at the other end. Now, if you're just doing as one continuous piece, then you can stop there. But if you're going to do it in 2 stages like I am, then take that 20 inches that you've got remaining and cut off 16 inches. So you should be left with a tag end that is 4 inches at each end, and then a remaining piece of 16 inches that you've removed that you can then use in order to make the slip knot that will attach to the butt. The first thing you need to do though is to kink about 1 inch or so of the cord that's got the strimmer line through it, bend it back on itself, and then start wrapping over the top of that kink. Initially, once we've heated it and have started to undo it, those kinks will be pointing in the opposite direction to where we want them to. But we're then going to turn the whole thing inside out, and that will tighten up the coils and make it much springier. And when that happens, those kinks will be pointing in the opposite direction, so they'll now be pointing away from the coils, and that's the direction that we want them in. So it might feel a bit counterintuitive to have it poking on the inside, but once we've finished, it will all make sense. Once you've got to the last inch or so again, without letting it unwind, again, we need to bend it back on itself. So hold it tightly as you can, and then with the string that you had, we're simply going to wrap it round tight so that it holds position. It's now time to heat it so that the paracord with the strimmer line holds its position once it's finished. Now this is going to go in some boiling water for about 15 minutes or so. It's then going to come straight out and put into cold water. So it's had its 15 minutes in hot water and then 5 minutes in cold water. And now hopefully when we take the string off, there we go, get rid of that, it should have held its place. First thing we do is look to see which way the coils are going. So on this one, they're going clockwise, like that. So what I'm going to do is fold it anti-clockwise, like that. And then I'll pass that anti-clockwise coil down. So once you've done that, firstly, you can see it's much tighter spring. And secondly, the ends that were pointing inwards are now sticking straight out, which is where we want them. So what I've done is taken all of the slack up so that when I finally tie it off, the whipping will bind the paracord together with that little 1.5 to 2 inches or so that's got strimmer line in it, and that'll give it a bit more rigidity. Okay, that'll do. Now for the simple whipping, take one of the pieces of your paracord. This is not the cheap tacky stuff that we used to bind the paracord onto our frame to melt it, and form a loop with one long end and one short end. Now all we're going to do is wrap the long end round back towards the loop and away from the little tag. So we'll do that a few times, trying to get the coils as close to each other as possible. Once you've got almost up so that the whole loop is almost covered, take your working end and pass it through the hole. Like that. Then take the other end, the tag end, the far end, and pull through. And what that will do is ease that loop through on the inside. Once you've got it halfway or so, that should do it. Pull tight. And that's your simple whipping. Then all you need to do is cut the tag ends off so they're nice and neat, and then melt down the ends, being careful not to melt the paracord that's underneath. Now you should have, if you're doing it in 2 stages, your 3 or 4 inches left of tag and your spare piece of webbing. This is the 4-inch bit. Now if you're doing it in 1 piece through, you can ignore this bit, skip it out. For those of you who are doing it properly, what we're looking to do is lay that piece of tag along there, fold it over, and then if you've got access to a sewing machine, we'll stitch it a couple of times along there, making sure that we've got a loop both with the paracord and the webbing through there. Ideally, what you want is for the loop to bind inside the webbing so that the webbing just finishes along the straight bit where there's the paracord with the strimmer through it. There we have it. I've just put a little bit of super glue in there as well just to bind up the stitching. You don't have to use a sewing machine. Any really strong glue, sort of Gorilla Glue or super glue or even epoxy resin, anything that will really bind fabric together will work just as well. But I like the finish of having some stitching through there. And as you can see, there's a nice hole through which we can place, if we can fit it, there we go, our last 16 inches of paracord. And obviously you can skip this bit out if you're making it just as one. Through like that. And then, just as we did before, a simple whipping to attach that to there. And that'll be that. So the whipping has been tidied up, and this is where you cut back in if you've just been doing the straight through method. We tie a simple overhand knot right at the end of the tag. So right as close as you can. You can put 2 in if you want. All this is becoming is a jam knot for your slip knot. There we go, nice big jam there. And now we do a slip knot, making sure that it's the running line from the rod leash that goes through. When it slips through onto the butt section of your rod, when you pull, all it does is tighten up onto it. So the more you pull, the tighter it gets, and that jam knot will stop it coming undone. And there you have your rod leash.